All right, I think we're live. Thanks everyone for being here for ZCon 2 Lite. We will be having this fireside chat in this session with myself. I'm Andrew Miller. I'm a professor at UIUC in Illinois and one of the founding board members of the Zcash Foundation. And I'm joined by Michelle Lai, one of the inaugural members of the Zcash Open Major Grants, who you may know from the last panel if you're watching these in sequential order. And of course, Zooko from Electric Coin Company, the original developers of Zcash. So the fireside chat format, as I understand it, is going to be a fairly informal, free-flowing conversation between us all. But we have a couple of topics that we have in mind to talk about. And I will be monitoring the Discord for questions to relay if anyone any good questions in there, and I plan on talking on Discord after it. What we had in mind for the theme of this discussion is going to be about decentralization. So decentralization to me is the most important thing in cryptocurrencies, and I think it's up there among privacy as some of the most important things that Zcash does very well. And building off some of the topics mentioned in the previous panel about ZOMG, I think it's really fun that we get to have this kind of three-person fireside chat, because I think it's a kind of nice culmination of some of the decentralization improvement efforts that I'm really proud of in Zcash. Like 6 years ago, there was no Zcash. About 5 years ago, there was only ECC, no Zcash Foundation. 4 years ago, there was no Zcash advisory panel that votes on behalf of the community for things. And a year ago, there was no such thing as ZOMG. So it's really neat to be able to talk in this way. I remember feeling last year during the dev fund debates and trademark agreement discussions, I felt the most seen when Chris Berniski, who mentioned this also in the last panel, said that, in his opinion, any cryptocurrency that wants to make the effort to become gradually more and more decentralized is going to have to walk a difficult path, something along the lines of what Zcash has done, and that I'm really proud of, in terms of, not taking decentralization for granted, not only just relying on technical measures like proof of work for decentralization, but actually doing the effort organizationally and socially to build spaces for power to be distributed more widely among different independent people and building more space for voices to be heard. So I'm really proud of the efforts of improving decentralization that Zcash has done so far. Although I know that there's a lot more work to do, it's something that I think is especially important. So with that framing, what I'd like to do is ask the question to both of you. What's your take on decentralization? What's your assessment of how well it's going in the Zcash ecosystem? And what do you think are the most important opportunities for Zcash to preserve and continue to improve its decentralization? So I will turn this question over to Michelle first, and feel free to introduce yourself along the way for anyone who's just tuning in and missed the last panel where you had to do that.
Yeah, sure. Just a quick recap. My name is Michelle. I'm ML Pseudo on the forums. I grew up in Singapore, worked in Hong Kong for a long time, and then spent time in San Francisco with Anchorage. Half my career in finance, and then the last half in tech and obviously crypto. Loving it in crypto so far, and really loving being a part of the Zcash ecosystem. I feel very strongly about personal freedom, and privacy is critical to freedom, in my opinion. So I think in general, you two are far ahead of me in terms of talking and thinking and theorizing on decentralization. But I think my reflection being in the space for the last 3 to 4 years is the vast majority of crypto projects aren't, in my opinion, meaningfully decentralized, right? Like you alluded to this. Some teams may have geographically distributed teams, but ultimately the decision making is still concentrated among a small group of people. And other teams may have DAO-like governance, so decision making isn't centralized, but the development of the underlying network relies on a single team. So arguably, they have very similar regulatory risk in some ways. So I think decentralization can sound pretty abstract because we don't have really great prevalent examples of how it would work. I mean, we have a few, but they're not prevalent. I think Bitcoin and Ethereum probably are the concrete templates we can iterate on. The major difference being they're so much larger. They're more like religions at this point, right? So you have people volunteering, donating, and really profitable or companies with large war chests that can fund so much of that work. I think Zcash is trying to move in that direction through multiple approaches, including setting up the ZOMG. And I feel like if ZOMG achieves our mission of greater ZEC adoption, this will be over time. We will then naturally create the conditions for this sort of spontaneously self-organizing decentralized network. When you have enough people believing in you, adopting ZEC, they'll create religion by themselves. So to me, the thing we have to do as representatives of the three organizations is to be very intentional about seeding and fostering this spirit of ownership and self-organization.
Do you think that the organizations that are funded through ZOMG themselves are likely to increase in influence in some way? I almost think of that as a potential for ZOMG to, by giving grants and then incorporating stuff with the other grantees to, increase decentralization that way.
I hope so. I think Holmes had a very similar point on the previous panel, which is that we're basically helping what started out as hobby projects turn into something that is world-class. And as they grow and they can generate their own source of funding, we hope that they become these pillars. Like say, I think just looking at some notes, I think the Ethereum has consensus, ChainSafe, Nethermind, Status, Gnosis, right? Hopefully we have our versions of these large and kind of self-funding organizations.
And those are all great examples. Those are all teams that have been working for quite a while and, are strengths in their own right. Okay, Zooko, do you want to take a stab at responding to this initial question and introduce yourself for the benefit of folks just tuning in?
My name is Zooko. I'm the founder and the CEO of the Electric Coin Company. I agree with both of you that decentralization is really crucial. I agree with what Andrew said, that it's the reason for the existence of the whole crypto space, really, and the value that everything in crypto provides is based on decentralization. I agree with what you said, that Chris Berniski previously said that any project that says we're going to decentralize is going to have to do something like what Zcash has been doing. And I really agree that Zcash is already really, really good in that respect. And I can tell from like firsthand experience that Zcash's decentralization is like deep and real, where I strongly suspect that a lot of the other like coins and projects, it's sort of aspirational, like they have set up some intentions or whatever, but in practice, you could quickly sort of find the center and strangle it if you tried. Whereas with Zcash, that's not the case. It really is already more resilient. There's no single point of failure, but we need to keep walking that path. I really strongly feel like Zcash is, this is like a good level of decentralization. I always thought that we should not decentralize too much too fast. Some other projects do that, where they start life with on-chain governance or whatever, but then it turns out the on-chain governance isn't the complete solution. And I always thought we should do what Chris Berniski said and decentralize continuously without stopping. But I feel like we should be really careful as the Zcash community. We should be really careful not to rest on our laurels at this juncture. We only have 2 entities, despite what you guys were saying in the last panel about having 3 entities. There's only 2 entities that, if you successfully attack them, you could freeze almost all, if not all, Zcash development. And we only have 1 jurisdiction that both of those entities live in. And the Zcash community can and should do better in decentralization to multiple organizations and multiple jurisdictions, so that it's that much more robust. Even though we're already better than 99% of all projects, but but this isn't good enough. We can't stop here. And I looked up some numbers in January of 2020, when the community settled on the specifics of the dev fund. Zcash was $30 a coin at that point, which means that the dev fund was worth about $8 million a year. And all the issuance, like all of the money that the ZEC holders are paying to proof of work miners and dev fund recipients, was $36 million a year, of which $8 million a year was going to the dev fund. And today the price is 125. A few weeks ago it was 350, I think, but today it's 125, which means all of the money that ZEC holders are paying to proof of work miners and dev fund is $150 million a year. And the part that's going to the dev fund itself is $36 million a year all by itself. And by the way, Vitalik Buterin recently wrote a blog post about this kind of topic. And he mentioned all of those different companies that support core development on Bitcoin and Ethereum, like Ethereum Foundation and Consensus and Chain Code Labs and so on. And he estimated in there that there was about $30 million. He said that there was a $30 million a year budget for the Ethereum Foundation itself. And that he estimated there was about $20 million a year going into Bitcoin core development from all those companies. So as it stands today, with Zcash at $125 a coin, there's, I think, probably more money going into Zcash core development than going into Bitcoin core development or Ethereum core development. So that's good if we can use it well, like we heard in the ZOMG panel about the really good things we're getting out of it. But what I think is more important is I think the dev fund is the source of decentralization. Like, there's two things. There's the open source software that anyone can run and nobody can log you out. You don't have to ask anyone's permission to get a copy of it and use the network and do whatever you want with the network. And then the other thing is that Zcash is self-funding because of the dev fund. And that means Zcash is not vulnerable to getting captured by some like donor, some like mega corporation comes along and starts paying all the programmers, which you think is great and you're really grateful, but then it turns out the whole thing is going to start serving the interests of the mega corporation instead of serving the mission eventually. So the dev fund is the source of decentralization, and it's whatever 5 times bigger now than it was when the community approved it in January 2020.
Do you think that there's the need then to, and you're advocating proactively further decentralizing organizations by having things outside the US jurisdiction? And do you think that we already get some of the decentralization benefit of that just by, showing that the community is capable of issuing a dev fund and therefore deciding where it's going to go?
That's a great question. For me, I like something Michelle said about different kinds of decentralization. Like sometimes you have an on-chain governance voting protocol, but there's only one development team or something. So it's kind of like a bottleneck thing. There's a layer or a set of things, and whichever one has got the narrowest, most fragile part would be sort of the point of vulnerability. So Zcash has a really, really decentralized and robust like protocol layer and software layer. It's totally out of control. Nobody, no dictator or all the dictators in the world could stamp out Zcash no matter what at that level. And then I think the dev fund is super important, and that's where I think that's currently the bottleneck. There's only 2 legal entities. So like if you sued Zcash Foundation and you successfully got a judge to like freeze the Zcash Foundation's bank account, and you also sued ECC, then it's like game over for Zcash, right? And then the other point of vulnerability is that it's all in the US jurisdiction. And the US is a great country. I love the US. I'm an American and I'm like patriotic, and ECC is all here and we're fighting the good fight and very successfully so far. But it's foolhardy for the Zcash community to keep all their eggs in one basket when they could instead decentralize more. Does that answer your question? Your question is about another layer, which is we've demonstrated that the community can collectively discuss and make decisions, and that Zcash Foundation and ECC will do what they say. And I think that's also a really important layer. But I think all the layers have to be decentralized, right? I think like it's not good enough. Like if the community collectively votes to do a thing, but Zcash Foundation and ECC are both like locked up because we're under attack, then that's useless. But I think that was also a good layer.
Sure.
And you know what? about that.
Well, I mean,
what
the
they'd
question
have
is
to
just kind of
do-
getting to the prodding at the, you know, balance between the you know, preparation for it versus being able to react, I guess.
Oh yeah. What they'd have to do is they'd have to network upgrade the whole Zcash blockchain to send the dev fund to a new independent entity, which they could, but it would be, I think it's going to be much easier proactively instead of reactively. And it reminds me of the other thing I wanted to say, which is that layer, the sort of like sentiment gathering and idea generation and communal discussion and coordination layer, I think that coin holders are currently excluded from just socially. And like Zec Pages is awesome. Everyone should use Zec Pages to chat on an anonymous, censorship-resistant Reddit that no one can censor. And I think like the community advisory panel and all the forum is a bunch of really great people. I've often said that there's like 100 or whatever people on the community advisory panel. If you read down the list, it's like the best list of the 100 best people in all of crypto. But nonetheless, I think that 100 is really not representative of the 100,000 or million Zcash users who are out there. So that's another thing that I think that layer also is actually, even though it's way more decentralized than like almost any other cryptocurrency except for Bitcoin and Ethereum, it's still not nearly decentralized enough in my opinion.
So I want to come back to two of the, in a little bit, I want to come back to two of the things that you mentioned. One, the coin holder voice, and also the regulatory and jurisdiction risk concern. Before that, I wanted to ask Michelle to chime in on the geographical diversity question. I mean, I think that this has been, in my mind, this has been an important weakness of Zcash, its US centricity. And I know that in the last in-person ZCon, which was already 2 years ago, I think we had multiple talks on understanding Asian markets and the potential for growth in Asia. And I know we've done a bunch of outreach activities and some translation efforts, for example, but I still think we have a very small presence in Asia, and you'd be in your Asia experience would give a good perspective here. So I'm interested in any and all thoughts you have on that.
Yeah. So I also really hope to see more Zcash involvement in Asia being more involved in Zcash, right? Like the privacy and freedom issues that Zcash try to solve is they're endemic to Asia, right? To look at Burma and Hong Kong, it's like ongoing situations where these values are at threat. I think a secondary benefit also of diversifying out of the US is not just regulatory resilience, but also one thing that I've found interesting is, so I've had conversations with different people at the ECC, including Josh Swihart, and when I hear arguments about why, say, Singaporean exchanges should list Zcash, the arguments don't make sense to me in this context, because I think our societies are built very differently. We have such different values. I'm not saying, I share all of them, but just as somebody who has grown up in this society, people care about different things very differently. People's idea of what a personal boundary should be is also very different, right? We have very Confucian values where you put everybody ahead of yourself, the individual. So if we wanted to import a version of privacy that is the current Western/US definition, it's not going to work. Nobody's interested, and governments are not going to let that happen, that chance. So I feel like one additional benefit is for Zcash to be natively born and bred in Asia at the grassroots level is people here can then define for themselves what's important to them, like what style and what depth of privacy is important. And so then privacy has a chance at survival. We're so many of our metropolises are famous for having lots of surveillance and nobody fights back. And I think that's because the alternative, which is the US version of privacy, does not work. And it's not interesting to most people. So I think that's kind of one reason I'd be very keen to help, spur up more interest in Zcash in the region. But the major barrier is, in my opinion, in the last 100 years, most of us were colonies at some point, right? We're still very focused on pragmatic things like people eating, typhoons, racial riots. And so when I have conversations with people, it's very hard to get them to start thinking about, oh, privacy matters. Oh, free lives matter. And I really don't know how to solve this problem.
Do you have any ideas for narrative elements that you think might catch hold? Like, by example, I mean, it's a difficult problem even in the West. We're kind of perennially, as privacy enthusiasts, trying to fix the problem that no one seems to care about privacy or think of it the right way. The simplest sound bites in the West, I think, are if you have nothing, you hide, you have nothing to fear, which is resoundingly rejected by people who think about it very carefully and work on that, but it persists in some way. And ideas like you still have a shower curtain because you value privacy. Everyone values privacy at some level, even if it's in a subtle way like that. Are there like kind of catchphrasey soundbite elements that you think can survive in the Asian thought space?
I don't have any good answers, but I think one element of more Asian cultures is people are always, there's this concept called face. You always want to save face. You don't want to look bad. You always got to present a well put together front. They're like self-expression is not really a thing. So I don't know, maybe this has something to do with the privacy that we want to forge in the community. That would be the closest, I think, because all the other values are about including if you have nothing to hide, then you don't have, you shouldn't be worried about it. And the community above the individual, all these don't lend towards privacy and individual freedom. So I don't know. That's why I'm begging people to apply to the ZOMG for literature and media ideas.
Was that a hand raise, Zuko? It looks like you went first of all, you went all pixely, and I did notice your phone shade orientation. Anyway, I'll call on you if you get this in the latency.
Yep, that's my hand. I have a thought on that from the American context. In America, there are basically three political orientations: libertarian, progressive, and conservative. And some people might at first think that privacy only appeals to one or two of those, or only in a certain way. But I actually think privacy is meaningful and desirable to all three of those political orientations, just for like different reasons, but it's the same privacy. So I think it's almost more of a communication or marketing than a fundamental issue within the American context.
Okay, so I'd like to go back to this question about regulatory risk. I saw lots of thumbs up in the Discord chat about the don't have all your eggs in one basket for decentralization. That for sure makes sense. Do you want to dig in a little bit to kind of the scary, unpleasant, and maybe call to action side of this? I mean, the way I would ask it is, I think everyone's aware of the potential for a brewing, next version of the crypto wars, in which privacy-enhancing cryptocurrencies play some role or are at the forefront of this public and policy debate and discussion. So, I mean, my question for both of you, I guess, is, what form do you think that would take, and what do you think are the important opportunities for us to do something about it or prepare to come out on top in whatever form the next crypto war takes? Zuko first, if you're ready for
it. Yeah, the scary question, which I hear a lot from people in the crypto community who are Zcash adjacent, and this is like the reason they're not getting into Zcash, is they say, won't governments ban privacy? And I think that's actually a really valid question. Like I say, in the US, ECC, all these years has fought the good fight, and we've been very successful, as demonstrated by regulators like New York Department of Financial Services and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and others recognizing Zcash's legitimacy and value, and the most highly regulated exchanges, Gemini, Coinbase, and Kraken, supporting Zcash and even doubling down on further Zcash support all along. So far, it's going great in the US, but I say the battle is just beginning. It took 10 years, maybe, for the public and the regulators to start finding out about Bitcoin and start getting their heads around it and start taking action. And Zcash is about 5 years younger than Bitcoin. So I think it's very unstable in the U.S. Well, it's stable. The U.S. is great. I have mixed feelings. The U.S. is great because it's got rule of law and institutions, which means everything takes years and years to get anything done, and it's always very consistent with the last thing and so forth. But it's also that the U.S. regulators and lawmakers and everyone is just getting to grips with this, and so we're just going to see the battle begin. And it's like that, like the diversity around the world should be one of Zcash's strengths. Like a bunch of Latin American countries are embracing Bitcoin right now. Zcash could get in on that, right? But it requires more decentralization and putting more bets and not just one bet.
I think the only thought I would add to that is Asian governments tend to be followers too. And to the extent the US is still, predominantly the predominant power in many matters of international financial controls, it is possible that Asian governments simply follow what the US government does. So I don't know. I think the takeaway from that, if we want to hedge against that risk, is to build more on networks that don't require central, say, exchanges or custodians to exist. Somehow maybe build some sort of parallel layer of support that doesn't rely on a company, being pressured or not being thrown into jail by the local authorities.
It sounds like you're making a comment kind of about the full stack of the Zcash ecosystem. Like if
Yeah.
it relies to some extent on centralized exchanges or others, then those become a weak point, and we might take on priorities of making non-custodial exchanges work really well.
Yes.
All right, and we are really coming up on the time so quick. I don't see how 30 minutes is a good enough time for a fireside chat. That's like less time than it takes to get a fire going. Speaking of combustibles, let's try to take as one last question, a question that Jack suggested we talk about on this, which is, I'm curious from either of you, what is your take on the environmental consequences of proof of work and what that says about the prospect of Zcash changing to something non-proof of work, such as proof of stake? Zooko looks frozen, so maybe I'll call on Michelle for now.
Oh, it's totally a Zooko question, though.
I heard just like a slight chirp of sound coming from Zuko's frozen face.
Not frozen.
Oh, I heard you say, "I'm not frozen" through the audio decoder.
Oh, he's off. Do you want to take that, Andrew? I think you're more well positioned.
It's a difficult question that I'm sort of ambivalent about. I mean, I think I view. Well, look, here's the way that I view this. I think that ignoring the moral concern about consumption of resources, I think that there's an undeniable cost. Like if you have one family that has to burn a furnace and another family that doesn't, all else equal, the one that's paying the power bill is consuming something that the other one's not. I mean, so in short, I think that just on a market basis, all else equal, a cryptocurrency that cuts down its power bill by only spending virtual power, which is, a little bit rosy-eyed, but, roughly what proof of stake is doing, I think it would just outcompete eventually in a market. Like you'll cut down costs by, cutting the furnaces running out of your budget. So, I mean, that's the furthest I've come to a coherent point about this. It's not something that I have a fully formed.
Zuko's back though, and we have 1 minute. How about we pass it over?
All right, Zooko, you want to say something in 30 seconds?
Yes. I have other reasons why I'm interested in proof of stake. I don't really believe that Bitcoin's destroying the earth, but it doesn't matter. Nobody's ever going to convince 90% of the people that it's not destroying the earth. Like that's just a fatal PR issue, and you're not going to overcome it with reasoning and argumentation. But I have other reasons entirely. Like you said, it's way more
you have
efficient.
8 seconds.
And also that efficiency might solve the problem with Zcash shielded assets. Like how do they reward ZEC holders? Maybe proof of stake could be part of the answer.
Cool. Thank you all. You're great. Love you all. Thanks for being at ZCon.
Thank
See you
you.
next time.
Bye.
Later.